25,000 years ago, this quiet gorge in the west of England echoed with a sound no one living has ever heard. Not a fox's bark, not a wolf's howl, something larger, something that, for 100,000 years, was Britain's dominant predator. This is the Eurasian cave lion, bigger than any lion alive today. A predator so successful, it hunted across an entire hemisphere, and yet almost nobody in Britain has heard its name. This is its story, and the story of how we found it again. 12,000 years ago, Britain looked nothing like it does today. It was a peninsula of continental Europe, gripped by ice, grassland, and cold, and it was full of animals we would now call exotic. Woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, giant deer, spotted hyena, and prowling among them, the largest cat ever to call this island home. Over the course of this video, we'll trace the cave lion from its first fossil discovery in a Yorkshire quarry to its role in Ice Age Britain's ecosystem, to the extraordinary art it inspired in human hands, and finally, to the mystery of why it vanished. Let's begin where the story always begins for extinct animals: underground. Our story starts appropriately with a cave. In 1821, quarrymen at Kirkdale in North Yorkshire broke into a chamber packed with ancient bone. It was so strange a find that the geologist, William Buckland, traveled up from Oxford to investigate himself. Buckland initially assumed it was a hyena den, and he was right. But mixed among the hyena remains were bones from something else entirely. The teeth and limb bones of a cat far larger than any known in Britain. What Buckland found weren't just bones. They were the first physical proof that lions, real lions, had once lived wild in Britain. At the time, that idea was almost impossible for people to accept. It would take more than a century of further digging. At Creswell Crags in Derbyshire, at Wookey Hole in Somerset, at Kent's Cavern in Devon, before the picture came into focus. These caves weren't lion dens themselves, in most cases. They were more like time capsules, places where bone, washed in by water or dragged in by scavengers, was sealed away and preserved for tens of thousands of years. Piece by piece, paleontologists built a map. Cave lion remains have now been recovered from more than 24 sites across England and Wales, a clear signal that this was not a rare visitor, but a resident predator present across the landscape for tens of thousands of years. And the bones themselves told a second story. Not just that cave lions were here, but what kind of animal they actually were. Because it turns out, calling this creature simply a lion undersells it considerably. Panthera spelaea was not the same species as the African lion you'd see today. Though the two are close cousins, it stood roughly 10% taller at the shoulder than a modern lion, and some estimates put the largest males at over 350 kilograms, heavier than a modern tiger. But size wasn't the only difference. Cave art, which we'll return to shortly, consistently shows an animal without the heavy mane male African lions carry today. Its coat appears to have been shorter, better suited to a cold, open environment than a warm savanna. In the 2010s, ancient DNA studies confirmed what the skeletons had suggested. The cave lion wasn't simply a cold-adapted version of the African lion. Genetically, it split off from the lion lineage roughly 2 million years ago, following its own separate evolutionary path across the mammoth steppe of Eurasia. That makes it a distinct species in its own right, more distant from today's lions than a coyote is from a wolf. Some researchers argue it deserves to be thought of less as a lion at all, and more as its own unique branch of big cat, one that happened to converge on a similar body plan. The skull tells you a lot, the brain case, the shape of the nasal bones. These are subtly different from modern lions. This was an animal shaped by tens of thousands of years of hunting on open, cold grassland, not the savanna. Which raises an obvious question. If it wasn't hunting zebra and wildebeest on an African plain, what exactly was it hunting in Ice Age Britain? To understand the cave lion, you have to understand the world it lived in. For much of the last ice age, Britain wasn't an island of green fields and hedgerows. It was the western edge of the Mammoth Steppe, a vast, cold, and surprisingly productive grassland stretching from Britain all the way to Alaska. This landscape supported an extraordinary density of large animals: woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, herds of wild horses and reindeer. The giant deer, with antlers spanning up to 3.5 meters, it was, in effect, Ice Age Britain's version of the Serengeti. So, what did the cave lion actually eat? Chemical analysis of fossil bone collagen, a technique that reveals an animal's diet by measuring isotopes absorbed from its food, points overwhelmingly to reindeer and wild horse as staple prey, supplemented by young mammoths and other large herbivores. Hunting animals this size wasn't a solitary endeavor. While we can't be certain cave lions formed prides exactly like their African relatives, the evidence is genuinely debated among paleontologists. Cave art repeatedly shows them in groups, suggesting at least some degree of social cooperative hunting. This is one of the areas where the science is still moving. Some researchers think cave lions were more solitary than modern lions, closer to a tiger's lifestyle. Others point to the group scenes in Ice Age art as evidence for social behavior. Honestly, the truth may have varied by region and by era. This was a species that existed for hundreds of thousands of years across an entire continent. What isn't in dispute is the sheer scale of its success. At its peak, the cave lion's range stretched from these islands, across the whole of Europe and Siberia, and over the Bering Land Bridge into North America, making it one of the most widely distributed large predators in the history of the planet. For a creature this dominant, this widespread extinction seems almost unthinkable, and yet we know exactly how this story ends. Before we get there, though, we need to talk about the other predator sharing this landscape, one that left behind something the cave lion itself never could: a record in its own hand of what it saw. In 1994, explorers in southern France discovered Chauvet Cave, and inside, one of the greatest surprises in the history of art. Painted onto its walls more than 30,000 years old were cave lions. Not one or two, but entire panels of them, rendered with startling anatomical accuracy. These weren't crude symbols. The artists captured muscle, motion, the way a lion's head turns to track prey. Some panels show what appear to be prides hunting bison together. This is, quite simply, some of the most sophisticated wildlife art created by any human being at any point in history. Elsewhere in Ice Age Europe, the lion appears again, not just observed, but transformed. The Lion Man of Hohenstein-Städel, carved from mammoth ivory around 40,000 years ago, fuses a human body with a lion's head. It's widely considered one of the oldest pieces of figurative art ever made. And it suggests the cave lion wasn't just prey or predator to Ice Age people. It was something closer to a symbol. When a Paleolithic artist chooses to carve a half-human, half-lion figure, they're telling us something about status, about power, maybe about spiritual belief. We can't read their minds, but we can say the cave lion clearly mattered to them, deeply. Here in Britain, the evidence is quieter but still telling. Worked cave lion bone and teeth, some pierced, likely for use as pendants, have turned up at Ice Age sites, hinting that people here also valued this animal beyond simple encounter. Whether as trophy, tool, or talisman, we can't say for certain. What we can say is that early humans and cave lions shared this landscape for tens of thousands of years, as rivals for shelter, as competitors for the same prey, and occasionally, almost certainly, as direct threats to one another. There's actual evidence of that rivalry: cave bear bones with lion tooth marks, human sites showing signs that people actively competed with lions and hyenas for the best cave shelters. This wasn't a passive coexistence. It was a genuine, ongoing negotiation for the same resources, a negotiation that for tens of thousands of years, the cave lion was winning. But around 14,000 years ago, something began to change, and it changed fast. The end of the last ice age wasn't a single event. It was a prolonged, uneven warming that reshaped the entire planet, starting in earnest around 15,000 years ago and continuing with sharp reversals for several thousand years more. As the climate warmed, the mammoth steppe itself began to disappear. Open grassland gave way to forest across huge areas of Europe. The great herds of horses, reindeer, and mammoth that had sustained the cave lion for 100,000 years began to fragment, shrink, and in many places vanish. This is the crucial point people often miss. The cave lion wasn't a generalist. It was a specialist, built for a very particular kind of open, cold, prey-rich landscape. When that landscape disappeared, the cave lion didn't have a fallback option. The fossil record traces this decline directly. The youngest confirmed cave lion remains in Britain date to roughly 12 to 13,000 years ago. Across the rest of Europe, the species appears to vanish at broadly similar dates, though pockets may have persisted slightly longer in parts of Eastern Europe and Siberia. There is no single dramatic final scene to point to. No last cave lion known by name. No exact date of extinction. The species simply thinned, retreated, and stopped appearing in the record. A slow fade rather than a sudden end. It's tempting to look for one villain, climate change or human hunting or competition from other predators. In reality, it was almost certainly all three, interacting over thousands of years. Habitat loss removed its prey base. Human populations were expanding and increasingly capable hunters and competitors. The cave lion was squeezed from multiple directions at once. And the cave lion wasn't alone. This was part of a much larger wave of extinction. The late Pleistocene megafauna collapse that claimed the woolly mammoth, the woolly rhinoceros, the giant deer, and dozens of other large Ice Age species across the northern hemisphere within a few thousand years of each other. Britain's largest predator, a species that had ruled this landscape for the better part of 500,000 years, was gone. What it left behind wasn't a legacy in living descendants, but in stone, in ivory, and in bone. Today, the cave lion survives only through what science has managed to reconstruct, and remarkably, that reconstruction is still ongoing. In recent years, remarkably well-preserved cave lion cubs, frozen and mummified in the Siberian permafrost for tens of thousands of years, have given researchers genetic material of a quality almost never available for an extinct species this old. These frozen cubs, with fur, whiskers, and soft tissue still intact, have allowed scientists to study not just the cave lion's DNA, but details of its actual appearance that fossil bone alone could never reveal. Every few years, a new specimen or a new genetic study adds another piece to the picture. We now know more about the cave lion's biology than researchers did even a decade ago. It's a genuinely active area of paleontology. This isn't settled history. It's ongoing discovery. For Britain, specifically, the cave lion is a reminder of how differently this landscape once looked, and how recently, in geological terms, it looked that way. 12,000 years is a heartbeat, long enough for the mammoth steppe to become the British Isles we'd recognize today. Not long enough for us to forget, if we choose to look. The cave lion is gone, but it left its mark. In a Yorkshire quarry, in a French cavern, in a piece of carved ivory 40,000 years old. Britain's lost animals aren't just names in a fossil catalog. They're evidence of a world that existed here, on this ground, within reach of memory. Next time on Britain's Lost Animals, we go underground again to meet the scavenger that shared these caves with the cave lion and very nearly outcompeted it, the spotted hyena. If you want to keep exploring the animals that once called Britain home, subscribe and join us for the next episode. Thank you for watching.